We've finally seen the last major launch of what has been a completely tumultuous year in the PC hardware space. Intel's 9th gen processors are out, Nvidia's Turing architecture has been released to market, and AMD's 2nd gen Ryzen and Threadripper processors have been around for, I guess, a few months now. As things settle down and we move into the holiday season, with CES right around the corner, it seems like it's a good time to take stock of where each player sits and examine why right now might be AMD's perfect storm of opportunity. Ready to dive into custom water cooling but unclear about what parts you might need? Check out Thermaltake's new M360 Plus RGB kit. Featuring a D5 pump res combo, 16mm hard tube, Pacific C Pro fittings, and the best RGB implementation on the market, the M360 Plus fits all mainstream Intel and AMD sockets and is fully expandable as your system evolves. Check out the link in the video description to learn more. First, let's focus on the CPU side of things. Ryzen's 2nd gen was very well received earlier this year. Although it didn't make huge performance leaps, or claim to, for that matter, the Zen Plus architecture provided a small bump in both single and multi-core performance, somewhere along the lines of 5 to 10% over original Ryzen in most tasks. This was mainly due to a refinement in the manufacturing process and switching from 14 nanometers to 12 nanometer FinFET. Although overall TDP went up slightly from 95 watts to 105 watts in the flagship 2700X, this was mainly due to the bump in both base and boost clocks over Ryzen 1 across the board. The release of Ryzen 2 was generally recognized as a stopgap between 14 nanometer and 7 nanometer and would serve as a bridge to Zen 2, which is likely coming next year. Intel's 9th gen processors launched last week to mostly mixed reviews. The entire launch was marred by the ugly Principal Technologies fiasco, where Intel published the benchmarking results from a paid third-party testing house as official data. Those results were misleading at best and intentional lies at worst, and showed the new 9900K trouncing any and all competition, especially that from AMD. The fact of the matter is that Intel didn't really need to lie here. The 9900K is exactly what they were claiming, the world's fastest gaming CPU. But given the fact that now, after almost 2 years, Intel finally has core and thread count parity with AMD after 4 years saying that more than 4 cores on the desktop was just not possible, you'd think that they'd just let the results do the talking. This doesn't even touch on the fact that if last year's 8700K was a furnace, the 9900K is basically just an open campfire and requires some serious cooling to operate efficiently. The 9900K is also just basically a paper launch at this point, as they straight up don't exist in the market for consumers to get their hands on. I still don't even have my review sample. When you look at how AMD's 2700X compares to the 9900K, yes, it's slower in games at 1080p, but when you're talking 1440p or 4K resolutions, those differences shrink or disappear. Not to mention that in productivity tasks, it's a straight toss-up, with advantages going back and forth depending on the test. And then we look at price, with the 9900K retailing between $530 and $580 for what still amounts to a pre-order, while AMD has slashed their prices and now sits around $300 for their flagship. Given Intel's bravado prior to the 9th gen launch and all of their marketing materials just blasting AMD as an inferior product, it's really not. Price to performance is an easy AMD win. Productivity workloads, which I assume many people who are looking for an 8-core processor will be engaging in, are basically a push, and unless you absolutely have no other choice but to game at 1080p, you won't notice any real-world frame rate difference unless you're staring at a fraps counter. With AMD's CES 2019 keynote fast approaching, Lisa Su is scheduled to talk about Zen 2, built on the 7 nanometer node and likely boasting significant performance uplift over Ryzen 2. AMD doesn't even need to do much here in order to really put the screws to Intel. They don't need more cores. They already have and will likely keep the pricing advantage, and they are close enough in benchmark results that any improvement will probably elevate them to the top of the charts. Given that Intel just released the 9th gen parts, AMD will have a real window to have not only the fastest, but also the cheapest high-end mainstream processor on the market before Intel has a chance to respond. This is a big deal. Okay, so on the CPU side of things, AMD has been competitive ever since Ryzen launched. So this isn't exactly unexpected. But what about on the graphics side of things? NVIDIA had a lot of goodwill built up from the Pascal series of GPUs. The 1080 was launched in early 2016, and subsequently we saw the GTX 1060, 1070, and 1080 Ti launch to best-in-class performance at what amounts to reasonable prices in today's market. AMD's RTG was late to the party, but launched Vega in August of 2017. Even with the launch refund pricing snafu aside, Vega wasn't well received. It was seen as power-hungry, expensive, and generally unavailable. Not to mention that although NVIDIA's cards suffered during the mining boom, AMD's offerings at the time were hit far worse and couldn't be found anywhere for anything resembling MSRP. But if we circle back with a little hindsight here, let's just take a look at generalized performance comparisons. This is an RX Vega 56. It's typically on par with a GTX 1070 in most titles, and even pulls ahead in some that use Vulkan or DX12. This is an RX Vega 64. It's typically on par with a GTX 1080. Now, this is a 1080 Ti. It has no equivalent in the AMD lineup. When Turing was announced, most people hoped that we'd see the same kind of massive performance leaps over Pascal that we saw between Pascal and Maxwell, the 900 series of cards. As such, NVIDIA would basically just be leaving AMD in the dust, forever unable to compete on the high end and playing a perpetual game of catch-up. But that's not, in fact, what happened. This 2080 only performs on the level of a 1080 Ti, with the 2080 Ti about 25 or 30% higher. So all AMD has to do right now is make that small jump up to 1080 Ti level of performance, and they'll have a card that competes directly with NVIDIA's newest products. They don't necessarily need to reach 2080 Ti performance to be considered a success, although given their starting position, it's probably within reach. This is all without even taking a look at pricing. Since the mining boom came to a sudden end, pricing on the Vega cards has come crashing back down to earth, and they can now be reasonably found for pricing equivalent to their NVIDIA counterparts. You can scoop a Vega 56 for under $400 and a 64 for under $500. If they can manage to keep their pricing reasonable on 7nm Navi, again, this is a huge window of opportunity for them to make a cannonball-sized splash. Check out the prices right now of the 2080. A card that few people are actively looking to buy is going for over $800. The 2080 Ti, which people are drooling for, is over $1,200 and is sold out everywhere. Imagine what would happen if AMD came to market with, say, a Navi 72, with performance comparable to a 2080 for $700, and a Navi 84 with 2080 Ti performance, say, for even $1,000. People would lose their minds. There is already a huge swath of my audience who prefers AMD to either Intel or NVIDIA and would rather use Team Red for all the things. These cards would sell like crazy and there would be real competition again. This would drive the market forward on both an innovation front and a pricing front, with both companies looking for a leg up. This is the opportunity that AMD needed, and consumers desperately should be hoping for. However, let's take a look at this from the pessimistic side. Given that AMD has built up so much goodwill over the last 2 years with Ryzen and Ryzen 2, and that people have high hopes for Navi, just like they did for Vega, letting people down again would be devastating for their brand image. If Zen 2 shows up and is basically just Zen++ with 10% better performance, or if Navi arrives again and is a power-hungry, pricey card with mediocre performance, what then? Would people just give up on hoping that AMD can return to glory? Would shares of AMD stock plummet in response? Will AMD be relegated to mid-range and low-end products, ceding their high-end to the competition? This would be awful for consumers. Intel and Nvidia are already hitting us with higher and higher prices each generation. If they have nobody to check them, it's you and me who will suffer the most. So are you guys rooting for AMD, and do you think that this is their window of opportunity? Let me know down below in the comments. Also, don't forget to check out the merchandise store link below. I hope you enjoyed the video, guys, and I'll see you next time.